people from watching ads. When people come to my stream, they don't see an ad. Pre-roll is turned off. They're not forced to see an ad in the middle of a conversation. They only see an ad when we say they're going to see ads, and that's during our 12-minute break. And that's how I like it. This session is going to be a little bit of a conversation about architecture, direction, and planning. This is kind of boost related, and today's supposed to be sort of a boost day. So that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about modern approaches to workstation configuration, particularly with an emphasis on education. Kimu, we will talk about it, Cloud Init, Ansible, containers, Docker, Terraform, Chocolatey, and Brew. It's important that we make sure that we set that the parameters that say we are not doing any service because they're requiring internet. Do it. Otherwise, they couldn't do it. They couldn't do it because 42 people all on the internet with a zero latency requirement for terminal access to Replit was too much for their network. And it failed. And I had to scramble. So this is not, I'm not just spewing shit here. This is coming from experience. I'm going to get a job interview. Can I use Linux on my desktop? Might not matter to you, but you better ask because you need to know that. Number two, am I going to be forced to do collaborative development over the cloud, or are we going to be working on individual development locally? And number three, can I work remotely 100%? Those are the most important questions. And I think it's because I'm required to do it at work. It reminded me, hey, people need to know how to do this at work if they're not given the option. And I think that's really important that you know that. So you'd be able to get that wonderful Linux-ness no matter what. And that the only time it makes sense to buy VMware is if you have a Mac M1 because you cannot use VirtualBox on it. You can only use VMware on it. That's the only time I know that you need to spend money on it. I think the commands for VirtualBox are actually better. Hell, you want to run Docker in Arch? Go for it. You want to run Docker in Ubuntu? Fine. You want to run it on Red Hat? Fine. You're already going to be using it as if it were in a server, which is the same way you would encounter it if it were in Kubernetes world. It's the best way to run containers, period. It just is. It runs instead of Docker Desktop on their host OS are making it, I think, a mistake in their decision-making process. They're building it based on what will run on my desktop, not what is best for my server environment. Therefore, if you have a VM, it's better. And you just put in there, Podman or Docker, you compare the two. The next thing I want to learn, but I don't use that. I use Docker CE because that's what we use at work. And I can have a different virtual machine. I can have one virtual machine here. I can have another virtual machine. If I want to test it out, I can try the two and compare them. But you can't do that if you commit to one on your desktop. Believe me, I know. I search the internet all the time. I even tell people, hey, rather than use man pages, learn how to search really quickly. I'm big into that. I do it all the time, and that's a heavy internet dependency. But I always know that I can go back to man pages or help documentation when I need to. It's one of the reasons I'm making Bonsai, by the way, because Bonsai is going to allow all applications to have embedded documentation that travels with them instead of separately in some package installer. Bonsai, B-O-N-Z-A-I. I hate to say it, but sometimes the Stack Exchange hit is better than the standard docs because you've got somebody with a specific problem and context, and you're not trying, you know what I mean? So I actually do agree that internet searching is better when you have it, but a lot of times you don't. Building a dependency on it is a bad idea, though, in my opinion. If you need to make a decision about what to learn and how to maintain the least amount of technical debt in your learning as a technologist, that's how you survive in this industry, is to learn the things that matter, not the things that don't. There's just too much to learn. You have to isolate. That means that you should be learning I believe that means that you should be learning virtualization, at least the approach to doing tech work with virtualization and containerization. And we have to find out what the leaders in the industry are. Their approach is valuable, but that the basis on Python and Jinja templates and the convoluted mess that has created is going to eventually kill it as kind of critical technical debt, fatal technical debt. And it's going to be replaced by something else, probably in Go. A good week looking into Vagrant, and Vagrant is awesome. But even the creator of Vagrant, the people over at HashiCorp, they're like, no, Vagrant got to replace. There's a new one. There's a new Vagrant coming out, and it's not gonna happen. So, I think that technical debt is too big. I I really feel like it's not going to survive because of its Python dependency, because of its Jinja dependency, and because of the move towards compiled applications and utilities. I think it's going to die. I personally don't think it's worth learning for me, and I'm going to stop. Ansible just stinks. It just smells really bad. It smells much better than Chef and Puppet and all those other things that have agent dependencies and stuff like that. But it still has this really, really smelly Python dependency that's going to die. Just do your own thing. I got rid of WSL and I went to a VM. And I put everything on a VM and I'm much happier now. And I talked about that for like 8 or 9 minutes in my video that I highlighted on YouTube yesterday. So go watch that if you want to watch it. But yeah, I don't know what to tell you about WSL2. The question, we're talking about VMs again. Why not just run Linux on the desktop? The answer is because I have a job. And because my job requires that I use Windows or Mac. And if you don't have a job, or you're one of the very fortunate people who can use Windows or Mac, Linux on your desktop at work, I see that changing anytime soon. Honestly, I don't see enterprises ever allowing Linux on the desktop. The closest we've gotten is Ubuntu desktop, and now Ubuntu's like downplaying their whole desktop offering because they want to focus on servers. And there's really no one championing Linux on the desktop except for Windows. I had asked my employer one question. I actually joked with him. I said, "Hey, can I use Linux on the desktop?" And they went, "No." And I went, "That's too bad. I wish I had asked that before I took this job. I probably wouldn't have taken it." And I was not kidding. I probably wouldn't have taken it because I'm picky enough that I would have put Linux on the desktop. The end of that story is that they ended up, that manager retired, and then I got a new manager, and that manager said, "We got these Macs here instead of Linux, but we can't get you Linux authorized. Why don't you try that instead?" And I did, and I'm super happy with it, but it means if I want Linux and Docker, I got to use a virtual machine. Terraform. I mean, they're just boosts. So don't think you're going to be a master of this and be able to certify. You're just going to know how to talk about it intelligently and have an exposure to it so you can go back and learn it more deeply. That's what a boost is about. It's really important that I say that because I don't want people thinking they're going to come away masters. So, good question here. Stuck on this stuff with WSL and VM. The biggest hang up for most people, and I don't know if this is your problem, but the biggest hang up for most people that are setting up a VM and can't SSH into it is almost always because they're not bridged and they don't know the IP number. So I would focus on that and see if you can fix that. Pipeline versus a filter. A Unix filter is a command that receives standard input and transforms it into something that goes to standard output. That's the definition of a filter in terms of like map, filter, reduce. The pipeline is when you connect a whole bunch of those things together in a functional way so that the inputs and outputs connect to each other. That's what a filter is. Beginner boost now. And there is, this is the goal anyway. If I don't fall over dead. We have a beginner one, and then we have another 18-week for infrastructure, and then we have containers and Kubernetes for 10 weeks. Again, this is just to boost you in the right direction. You learn Bash, you're already thinking like a functional programmer, and you're using it all the time on the command line. Pipelines are functional programming, and the sooner you learn how to make pipelines go with each other, you're going to be learning to do things better. And that's why Lisp and functional things are so much more powerful. Why are we here? We're here because these are the jobs for which I based the original boost. So the level 1 boost is supposed to be providing skills that are consistently applicable to every one of these jobs originally. Between web development and software engineering, I think that they're radically different. And I think web developer is a more accurate term. That is the term that the government uses. Software engineer has a much different term. I'll tell you about that right now. Here is, first of all, a misnomer. You can't even call yourself an engineer in Canada unless you have certain training. I don't like the word engineer for developers. I know developers use it all the time, and I believe that they're doing it incorrectly. If you're not dealing with true engineering, I don't think you should call yourself an engineer. There's a lot of people I respect who disagree with me. Developed by a NASA scientist who was sick and tired of not being classified as the rest of the engineers and decided to invent a term to call themselves an engineer. And the other engineers were doing chemical and physics and mathematics and stuff like that. And all of a sudden, this person wanted to be called an engineer as well. That's a true story. A appropriate thing to do. I think that you should call yourself a software developer and be done with it. And I don't think that you should ever call yourself an engineer at all unless you're doing true engineering. I agree with the laws in Canada about that. It's not. To me, it's not web development. The only time it approaches engineering is when you're doing really complicated architectures where you have a lot of things all over the place that are interconnected. And that's kind of engineering. For years. At Nike, I was Nike's webmaster, and I got interested in this stuff on the back end. The system stuff, the Linux stuff, the Perl coding, and I became a Linux systems administrator and engineer at that point. Telling me, please send us people, and it's also the career that people are dying. They cannot find enough people to do this. It's not just DevOps. It's infrastructure engineering, if you will, plus DevOps. And that equals, Kubernetes cloud native engineer and that kind of thing. Those are the substantial jobs. The question then is, well, what does that mean? What do we learn in the boost? What goes into the boost? Do we put Python in the boost? Do we put JavaScript in the boost? Do we put any of those kind of things? Yeah, you can CompTIA Cert Plus. Yeah, you can get started that way, but I don't know if I would go that route. But what do we include? Very long time. I've been doing this for, more than 12 years at this point, since 2013. And my goal has always been identifying the things that you need to check off, you need to learn. Do you make yourself a roadmap and then get you pushed down the road? Yes, so you can the open credential merit system. That's a way, it's a thing we kind of thought of together here, where you can know a list of the things that you need to know, and then you can check off those bullets and know what you need to know. That's Occam's system, Occam's boost, Occam's badges, whatever you want to call it. So that is something I've worked on and I want to get back to. Base career for the boost. Because preparing people for web development as a part of this, it's not really a cadre, but do we want to include web development? Slow I try to go, and no matter how much I try to back down. And then one of the things I love about Leon is he does not do that. In fact, if anything, Leon is a little bit too slow, in my opinion. But that's why I burn people out. So, Ansible web serving with Flask. Please don't say that again in my presence. I'm having fun. But I used to think Python Flask was the shit, and it's not compared to NetHTTP and Go. It's not. No way. Meaning people use it in the wild. All of those indicators are totally full of shit. They're all full of shit, because go look at their criteria for how they base those things. And then ask them if they ask anybody in the enterprise about their deployment infrastructure. Nope. They're all full of shit because they can't get visibility. It's one of my biggest complaints about this. They can't get visibility into the millions of systems that are working behind walled gardens, that are corporate secrets that no one's ever going to tell you about or answer a survey about. So all of those surveys are total bullshit. A decision. I've killed my darlings, like they say, and we're going to get rid of machine learning and web development as a criteria for even the earliest beginner boost, so that other people can cover those things much better than I do, and that'll free up some time for us to focus on the stuff that's not covered, like Go and Bash. File, and now you have a script. The end. It's not even complicated. And when you realize that you're already coding every time you enter something on a command line, it's pretty powerful. And then you just put in that. I think it's a very unpopular opinion, but I think Bash is the first language people should learn. That's very important. So I have to say this about Java. I really gave Java a black eye when I started teaching educational wise. I was like, why are people teaching Java? And I really shit on Java a lot, and I hate it. I won't get a job in it. It's a great language for getting a job, but there's something about Java that I didn't realize. Java is fantastic because even though it's painful to learn, it forces people to learn strict typing. And that's the one positive thing from Java. Now, there's a ton of negative things about Java that I think you shouldn't do, or learn and single inheritance. I think that is the single death knell to the language as a beginner language. But learning what types are and to do them strictly and how to make interfaces is core to any beginner learning. Without the inheritance, it has interfaces. It has all the good things that you need to learn that come with a strict language. That's why I think Go is potentially a really amazing language for beginners, because it teaches them those things without the complications and overly verbose syntax. Really, probably the loosest and goosiest of languages, the Bash, and then we'll have the strictest and most popularly used modern language in Go. And I think between the two, you'll have enough basis to pick up anything else that you need to along the way later on. I use Go and Bash for really core things, including reading source code for Kubernetes, and yet these things are not taught in school. So I feel like I have sort of a moral obligation to put the priority on them in the boost because they're not being taught fucking anywhere else. The language prevented them forever from doing anything but a single line lambda for an anonymous function. It's fucking hilarious. It is so funny. And it's also tragic because Python will never be able to overcome that. They had done compilers before. They just sat and watched the whole world run into the fucking wall. And then what do you get? You get HCL from Terraform, the next hottest thing, right? It's a configuration language. It's not YAML because it has brackets, because it's an actual language that has, and they've dealt with all these issues. I know. I hate strict typing. It takes me so long to do anything, particularly if you've been written in Perl, Python, or Shell, or JavaScript, or Bash, and you got shit done so fast and quick and easy and everything. Like, I love Bash. That's why I love for it. And you're like, the first time you do strict typing, you're like, oh my God, I fucking hate strict typing. And that's how you start out the world. You start like, oh, I'm never. You get good. You start working on a big project. You start working on a large project, and that's got thousands of lines of code. And you get burned and burned and burned by problems. And all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, I love it when strict typing catches my errors for me. Bosch and POSIX and why how scary they are. You should probably go look at that. But we're going to talk about it. But Go, it takes you forever to write anything, which is why I'm writing Bonsai, because I want to make it as fast to write stuff in Go as Bash. And I'm going to start writing everything in Go myself because I want it to be portable. And I really don't like to say, but one of my primary motivators to moving back all of my utilities and stuff back to one, two-liner Go programs is because they will work on Z shell systems and Bash systems without a problem. Yeah, I actually said that. And the reason for that is because more and more people are going to have to put utilities on their Macs without installing a full Linux environment or upgrading their Bash. And they need to do it. I would rather do that and not use userbin in my shebang line and give them a Go program that runs on Windows, Mac, or Linux any day. Not everywhere. I mean, Bash is still the standard on all Linux systems, but Z shell and shells like it are standard on Arch Linux. They're standard on Apple, and they're standard on things like that. Now, I don't particularly like that that's true, but it is true. And therefore, what do you do about that? Well, there's two things you can do about that. The first one is you can start using userbin env and then find your Bash, whatever, and force people to install Bash or something, or write it in Python and force them to install Python or Perl, and hopefully they have Perl still, which, by the way, most still do. And you can write it consistently if you want to stick with an interpreted language. But there's another solution to this, is to write all of the same stuff in Go and create cross-compile releases of your utilities that will run on anything. They will run on anything that Go supports, which is pretty much like everything on the planet. And then that runs in binary mode. So let's say you write a utility and you say, I want this to run as root with elevated root permissions, right? Can't do it with a shell script. You have to have something that's compiled. There's another reason to write your utilities in Go or Rust or C or whatever. But Go is the fastest to do it, and it has the greatest batteries included library for doing that kind of thing, including web development, Homo timers that work on Windows, and they can run it from fucking PowerShell. Who cares, right? And that's a better solution long-term for most people. And so you're going to find me doing a lot more Go coding for even the most minimal utilities going forward because of that. Not even overstate this. Generics have turned Go into a language that's much, much easier to write utilities in because it's so generic. You can write filter functions and things like that apply on any data type you could possibly imagine. It's much more closer to Bash, actually. Right. Definitely a quick path to learning other tech and lowering that resistance is almost always to take a step back from the current project and observe and learn more about the issues you're running into, right? Oh boy, learn that a lot from doing something the wrong way. Far more than what I've learned from doing something the right way. And that's how we learn. So there's nothing wrong with it. Okay, let's count how many days it's going to take before you're back on Linux on the desktop. Which, by the way, I never did. By the way, I never got on Linux on the desktop. Did I? I got a Linux server on my Windows desktop. So there. So they weren't right. They were just right about me getting burned by WSL2, which totally happened. The most significant thing I've heard related to functional programming recently is that the Unix philosophy and pipelines and Unix filters are functional programming. And it just blew my mind. I never thought of command line shell scripting as functional programming, and it totally is. Now, there's been some talk about anonymous functions and why they are good. Even if in Python you can have higher order functions even without anonymous functions, and we're going to be talking about that while we do some coding in Bonsai tonight. We're going to be spending a lot of time on use of functions, generics, and Go in Python. So this method of having a function call down here, and of course it doesn't have parentheses, it means it's not being called, and then having it be the value, that's completely valid Python code and Go code, but it's just kind of a waste. And what do I mean by it being a waste? What I mean by it being a waste is I really don't need all that, right? I can put those things down here and be much better off by just making it an anonymous function, and then I have the name and everything all there together, and everybody's happy. Sorry, PWD. It's a good idea to always put the PWD in there so it works anywhere from anywhere. And then home / dot vim. That should work, plus or whatever. And they're cool because they're functional. That's why they're so cool. They're kind of a short-winded way of doing lambdas, but they also allow you to use multiple lines if you need to. With Emacs windows, I can copy and paste between things that are not Vim and have them go back and forth. And people say, well, you can use buffers. I say, I use buffers all the time because I use Unix filters and just store the stuff in a temp directory, which, by the way, works when I want to use the shell without Vim at all. So that's why. What? Yeah, you don't need all that. You can just use plain old shell or Perl or whatever. Or if you want to, you can write a Go code. Or you can write a Lua, but write a Lua script. Don't write a Lua fucking plugin. Write a Lua script so that the Lua transformation script will act as a filter any other time you want to use it, and then put it in your scripts directory. That's the way to do Unix. They're awesome because they're designed to move on to do all that stuff. That's why Go is so phenomenally popular in that space, because it's addressed all of these issues head on directly in the fiery furnace of Google originally, and now it's moved on. What has learned is that you can never, especially if you're in IT, like you're distributing things, you can never depend on a version of an interpreter to be on the endpoint. And even if you could, you would be making a huge, massive security risk, because you can never be sure that interpreter hasn't already been compromised. And that's horrible. Is to create checksummed, signed, single, statically compiled binaries that are transportable to any system that can be cross-compiled for any target system. And that is why Go is the dominant language of the day for doing exactly that. It's the safest and easiest. The idea of interpreted languages is dead. It's dead, dead, dead. The only place that interpreted languages is hanging on is because of containers, and people can run their glorified container, their interpreted languages in a nice safe container within the cloud, and they don't have to deal with all the issues. But for deployments, no. The interpreted languages ship has totally sailed. It has moved on. It is done. Application distribution. Yeah, I have not heard him talk about that, but I have no doubt it's a very interesting take on the whole distributed stuff. Yeah, the kernel is coming up. I want to be very clear. The Rust is not in the kernel, nor is it ever planned to be in the kernel. And Linus Torvalds explicitly says so in the emails about this topic, if you care to read them instead of all the shitty blogs that are written about this topic. They have said it might be in the driver, but Torvalds specifically said it might be time for an extra language to write drivers in, and it might not be Rust. Those are his exact words. The people that are telling you anything differently than this they're blowing this issue up. They don't understand it, and they're frankly lying to your face. I want to pass a first-class function to this. I want to pass a function that returns a string, right? And I don't care about anything else. I just want to return strings. So I can return something, and we're going to start to see this break down. Boom. That's right. We just hacked Go to take a function as a type to printf, and we're going to make a proposal to Go and see what they say. Maybe they'll take it. You never know. It's only 2 lines of change. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to make a video about this. This little tiny patch to the FMT library would allow us to do some really amazing changes. And I really want to see it make it in. Let me give you a sense of this. Real quick. And we could define interfaces for structs, and we could actually pass in something like this. We could get a function here, or we could do it inline like this one here. And when it would print it, it would actually print out the right thing. So this one prints, this is using the hacked version that I made, and this is using the non one, and we get a reference. Wouldn't it be great if it did that? So that's going to be it for me tonight. Yeah, so that's going to be it for me tonight. I'm going to go ahead and make a PR for that later and see. I mean, it's such a small thing. I'm just going to go ahead and submit it, but I look forward to doing more tomorrow. Bye.